Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I am your host, John Jewett.
And I am your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. Ready ahead for your show. That rarely happens, but we're going to talk about it anyway today because hopefully if you've listened to Luke and I long enough, you started mapping out the right timeline for your prep and you're not making mistakes or as many along the way to where maybe you actually do land ahead for your show. Mm-hmm. Today, we are going to dive into what to do when that magical window opens up and you are already peeled to the bone.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah, I think so. There's a lot of directions you can go with this. I like to address the psychology of the client going into the prep, that this is a good thing and not a bad thing first. Because I do feel like some people, and maybe I'm sure you've experienced this as well with working with athletes, like the fear of getting too stringy or the fear of being peaked for too long or things along those lines, where they see being ready early as potentially being a bad thing. And I've come across this quite a few times this past 12 months where preps have been longer in duration in order to get them ready ahead of time. And they're questioning that fact, I think more from not wanting to run as long of a prep. But what do you see with that, and how do you manage that on the forefront? Because I think that expectation is huge before you start getting into the nuts and bolts of laying the framework of how to manage someone who is ready early.
Yeah, I guess it goes back to, and I actually was on a podcast with Milos, and they're like, yeah, it used to be 16-week preps everyone would run. That's just what you did. Or even before that, it was 12-week preps. And so I think they've gotten the stamp of what is an expectation of a prep timeline, mm-hmm. to where most people were never ready ahead. And those were all the genetic freaks out there that could prioritize a prep heavily. And so no one was ever ready ahead. And so the idea of just trying to maintain all that tissue. And I think we've come a long way just in the information age of understanding that a fat loss rate that's overly quick leaves you with the greatest potential for muscle loss. And if you work so hard in that off season for that size, do everything you can to bring it to stage. Because it's not just about a striated glute show. It's also about having big enough muscles as well. So the issue with running out of time and not being ready ahead is far greater than being ready early.
I agree.
Because if you're not ready at all, well, what does it even matter? And I would definitely argue the psychology side of pushing back a show is so much harder than being ready ahead and knowing you need to hold a little bit of condition for a while.
Yeah.
Okay. And I've just run into this issue with a few clients that the timeline we set out, it was reasonable, but the rate that we went at became unreasonable. And for facts just around, that's just how the body kind of was responding. And we're like, hey, we need to reevaluate this. And when someone gets committed to a show, you get emotionally tied to it. It's really hard to break someone free of that, especially if they don't have the maturity level yet to understand that the big important thing is bringing the right physique to stage. The location doesn't matter as much, but you still have some people that, man, I'm going to do the Texas Pro, and that's the show for me. The other thing around that too is sometimes you don't even have the opportunities, right, for pushing a show back. But for those individuals, you have to address it early enough, for one, that in a delicate enough way too, so you don't put a failure pressure on them that, hey, you're getting behind, because it really sucks to feel like that. So there's an eloquent way to bring up that conversation and bring up hey, what your goal here is bringing the best to stage, right? Let's watch how this rate moves. And if it's not going to be right over these next weeks, let's make sure we nail it for the right timeline for you.
Yeah.
And I think just even verbiage around that kind of helps soften that transition to lay out expectations and help transition a client to a farther back timeline if you needed to, right? And the clients that I had to do that on, it was well received doing it that way.
Yeah, same. I agree.
So I think with information coming out now that longer preps could be more ideal. I know people think that long preps might mean more muscle loss, but that's just not the case at all, because it gives you opportunities to, as you get leaner towards the show, be able to have higher, more refeed days, decrease the deficit in anything. At the time when you're more susceptible to muscle loss, you're now in a greater position to uphold that tissue because you have more food present and you don't have to run as aggressive of a deficit. So that's kind of where we would stand with setting out timelines and expectations for clients. And, as we brought that client closer to stage, you kind of know, like, if you're about to nail it ahead or not.
Yeah, I think what's cool with that setup is you now have an athlete coming in that psychologically is prepared to feel like it feels like to be in contest shape for a decent amount of time. Like that's I don't care how you get there. If you get there low food, high cardio, low cardio, like whatever those variables look like, it's not a pleasant feeling. Like,
no, it sucks either way.
It's awful. It's miserable. And like someone who is prepared for that, it handles that so much better because they know that the expectation is that we're going to start to see some of these strategies we're going to talk about in order to bring about the best look on show day. Now, I do like to frame this around where are we catching the athlete that's ready early, because I see a couple different ways of getting there. For everything from like the guy who pushed a little too hard, high fatigue, and it just happened to rip off on the back end, to the perfect prep, right? Where it's like you're catching someone, they're doing great, you're kind of managing fatigue perfectly, and it's like a coaster in type of a situation. Is there a place you would rather start within that kind of like framework or spectrum that you would prefer as far as like what happens next?
Let me ask you, because I know you've had this situation pop up, and I have some other ideas too around it. Is that is everyone ready mentally to be ready ahead, and could you be ready too far ahead? I guess what is the ideal and the less ideal? Because you have a new client, right?
Yeah,
they've never been that lean before. Man, trying to hold that, I don't. It might be unreasonable no matter what. Like, that might let it fall apart, or having someone that is more experienced, that is a different story. So what is, I guess, the ideal first for a timeline that's not too far ahead but is not too short either?
Yeah, so the caveat to the client that can't handle it typically isn't doing a big enough show where moving a show forward is a problem.
Yeah.
So like if they're ready 6 weeks out of the intended show, we can typically find something that's 3 weeks out and just go ahead and do that as the first show. Because typically, like you said, they're first or second time competitors. They're trying to, gain their experience at the regional level, potentially win their first regional overall. Like that's kind of the goal set within that athlete that potentially has problems handling that or holding that, where moving it forward is probably not as much of a problem. Now, you get that with the athlete that's doing USAs and that's the pro qualifier they're doing and you're ready 6 weeks out. They should be a little bit more emotionally mature to handle that. But ideally, I like athletes ready somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks out. I feel like once you start getting outside the framework of 4 weeks out, you're almost reversing them for 2 weeks to bring them back down, and it just gets a little messy, and it's just kind of where like 4 weeks, I feel like I can actually run like 2 test peak weeks in that time frame. And I did this with Emily King last year. She ripped down a bit faster than I expected. She was ready about 4 weeks out of the show date, and I just ran 2 peak weeks back to back, and we just had a predictable model by the time it was ready to step on stage. But I will say anything further out than that for me is probably too far.
Yeah, I'd agree. And some people you could have some people that could fade and lose track. But I think for the most part, 2 weeks is a nice spot because it does give you a week is a nice time to bring food back up and then coast them in a peak week, which I know we'll get into that a bit more. Renee and I'll give you, the example here, like Renee being someone that is, well, she's kind of newer. I mean, she hasn't been competing for very long. This is her 3rd year competing, but
that's wild.
But when you live with me, you have, it's like a Spanish immersion program. Like you dropped into Mexico, you're going to learn Spanish really quick. So when you're dropped into like, this is how you live the optimal bodybuilding lifestyle. It's like you're going to catch a lot of ground than someone that's like been trying to figure it out on their own for 6 years or whatever. But anyway, so with Renee, we started her prep 20 weeks out for doing Tampa, and we were saying she was like, man, she diets so fast. It's surprising. Like I'm going to give her enough time, but then she'll just start in the middle of prep, really start pushing forward quickly. And so we're like, wow, I think you look this many weeks out. And so it wasn't even Chicago. That would have been 18 weeks. It was all the way back to Austin, which was another 2 weeks. So now you have someone that was doing a 16-week prep, ready 4 weeks ahead. And we're now 2 weeks before Austin. And yesterday we're like, you're ready. Like I was like, the condition, I was like, it's there, And so really it was, I would say 13-ish weeks of active fat loss. Because we had a 1 week kind of deload. We dialed it back, then dieted her back down. Now we're ready 2 weeks ahead. So it's really not much active fat loss time when you break it down that way. But giving her the timeline, we had the opportunity now to do those things and have a deload, give her more food, and then also be ready ahead to where we can pull some fatigue off. And I'll tell you, she still feels she's feeling it. Like it's not easy. So let's see, like last week, she dropped over 1% body weight, which I'm like, this is pretty quick for being this lean. I ended up adding in 60 grams of carbs to her baseline diet, which was about a 10% increase in calories. Mm-hmm. Over the last week, she pulled down another pound. So it was still a deficit, just slowed it down. And that's when she landed at being ready. So being ready, I'm like, okay, we're 2 weeks ahead. What can we do with that? And so I wanted to test out with her doing something that would be pretty representative of trying to like glycogen loader, carb loader off of 1 day and seeing how long it takes her to get back to a baseline of the look where she's like full and hard. Mm-hmm. And so she went from 250 grams of carbs as her base diet. I bumped her up to 450, which if you looked at our podcast with like Joe Jeffrey, we're talking about carb load amounts. And so this was like 7 grams of carbs per kilo, a body weight for her, which is kind of right in the middle range of what's reasonable for a 24-hour load, and put that in yesterday. So I was going to see how to digest, how does she wake up, does she like get too watery, does she get full, whatever. And it was tough because we, for one, added in strictly non-fibrous carbohydrate, because if you have someone that's on prep, they're hungry still. And if you were like, oh, I'm just going to eat bowls of oatmeal of 200 grams of carbs, like, yeah, you're going to be a mess. And not that she wanted that. I was like, I laid out the diet, but it was all rice-based additions, right? Yeah. Which worked out, but hunger was still sky high yesterday, and training was still rough. Like you look at the diet, like you don't complain to me about being hungry. She's like, I'm still really hungry. I was like, I know. So anyway, we put that day in. She woke up today. She was up 2 pounds. Okay. Fuller. Yeah. But watery. Yeah. And that's part of the issue is like even yesterday, the environment's not going to be the same as peak week, but it just helps give you an idea because she still trained, right, and did cardio. And then also she ended up getting a poor night's sleep. And then likely it also gave me some insight, though, that I'll probably need to pull fiber down way lower because of the food volume if I was to run something like that. And so we took pics this morning. I'm going to take pics again the next day, and we'll see if she ends up pulling back down. Now, I don't really like the variability and what that did, so we might just do the linear load and on peak week rather than just like this big like 20% increase in carbs over baseline. Just have like 5% addition each day till we see like the best look. That might be a little better digestion wise for her, but anyway, knowing like that her baseline diet also was still a deficit, I increased her base diet 10% calories as well. And so I split it between adding like fats and carbs in. So she had like 10 grams of fat addition because she was around like 35 grams of fat, which is pretty low. It's like getting towards trace fats, but so that's why like that spurred that on and to help with hunger management. So that's a consideration in it. Then also like, I think she's getting to a point where she has a very reasonable amount of carbohydrate for training because she's close to 300 grams of carbs now as a base diet, and she's 130 pounds. So this is over 2 grams per pound of body weight of carbohydrate. So very, very much enough. So it made sense to bring fats up. So that's kind of where we're at, how we're handling like being ready 2 weeks ahead. Give her a high refeed day. Kind of see what that does, see if that might be an approach we wanted to take, and then see how she pulls down. And then we'll probably have one more opportunity to do a little bit of testing, and then just ride that into peak week from there.
So there's 2 things from that I would pull as like the big goals from what you're doing here that I think is the most valuable pieces of being ready early. And that's going to be, 1, the loading strategy that you're going to be using into the peak week. Like you pointed out that you probably going to lean a little bit more on a linear load because that food volume from the single day large increase tends to sit on her a little bit more aggressively. But on the secondary, finding that baseline diet that holds her around that place that you like her to be just under for a stage weight. Because like waking up, because ideally you're having 1 to 2 meals with some fluids and walking on stage, right? And I think that those 2 pieces are undervalued items for going into a peak. Because I know you've done it, I've done it. Running a peak blind is one of the most stressful things you ever do. Like you're just constantly like conversating with the athlete, making sure they're staying on top of fluid and sodium and steps, and gauging the response on a meal by meal basis. You're starting that process like way further out than you typically would on someone you've ran testing with. And the person you've ran testing with, like you could almost, I mean, it's not that predictable, but you could almost write what's going to happen on peak week before you even got there. And the value in knowing that you can land it within 2 to 3% of your favorite look is so valuable in consistency and showings and placings, really, when it comes to your athletes across the board.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's part of the goal of it, right? To have something a bit more predictable. I think also it's getting the athlete to a much better mental and physical state that primes peak week too. That'll just set you up to where your athletes almost peak before peak week in a sense, because if you have someone that goes all the way up right to peak week with a lot of fatigue, sometimes you won't pull that all off in enough time, and you might underestimate the time that's needed to do that. And so I know we're talking about just like the testing of the carb load and everything, but a big piece of that is the mental and physical side to making someone feel pretty fresh, and it can make you feel much more tolerable being that lean as well. And so it's not just, energy in, it's energy out. So we would look at Renee's programming and see like what is the most fatiguing aspect for her, and getting her close to that maintenance calorie level for one, or maintenance energy balance is what I really should say. Because if you had someone like Renee doesn't do a lot of cardio, she's doing like 35 minutes, 5 days a week, and 15,000 steps. So for her, that's pretty manageable. But I have some other clients that do that many steps and also do 2 hours of cardio a day. And for them, like pulling back on the cardio side is huge.
Yep.
Now it could be the duration, it could be the effort level. A lot of times I find it's a little bit of both. So if I can start moving that down to closer to maintenance of energy balance, and at the same time bringing food up, I'm now, for one, the mental side of that, right? Like you feel better just having more food, daily energy, your legs are less fatigued, dropping off fatigue. You're also could very well start getting better sleep. And then all that too could, and my goal also with holding someone for longer periods is making sure training is at least maintaining now. And like for my own prep, this has been a struggle. Like as I get to the last bit to come off, training is very hard to hold on to performance wise. And that would be a concern doing it for a long duration, is that I might start drifting and fading some. So if I can manage the fatigue side really, really well, and also the training piece to where I can maintain that performance, that is more manageable for holding someone over the longer course. So like for Renee, her volume's pretty well set up to where it's manageable. We have like some compound movements that are basically down to like one set now.
Yeah.
And that's it. But you know, she's doing well with it. Like her core is just so little. Like she's got like 24-inch waist. So like to get under a squat bar, it's like, it's, you know, you're not going to be able to brace well. So my main things here is that she can still output in the gym and not fade this past week. But all the things I just mentioned around managing cardio and the nutrition side will leverage and allow her to do that too.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. And would you argue probably Renee's a little bit more on the very well managed fatigue side of the equation of like the average bell curve of most people you would prep, correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, this is her life, you know, that she basically, if you looked on paper, Renee is a career competitor. Like,
yeah.
So that is top priority. You know,
the reason I bring that up is because that time period for the athlete that had to push hard to get there looks a little bit different. And I've had it happen where that process starts to speed them up almost to a detriment. So I had a couple preps last year where the rate of loss wasn't quite what I was expecting through that middle portion of prep. And so I was like, hey, we really need to step this up a bit just to make sure that we get there on time and that we're ready a little bit of ahead. And so that late middle portion of prep to the last portions of prep were a little bit harder than I was expecting it to be for these athletes. And so they're coming into this 2-week time period out way more fatigued than they would have been if the rate of loss would have been a bit normal. And I had one prep in particular that I'm thinking of where it resulted in running high days. So it was about a 15% increase. To start, it ended up being a 20% increase on baseline for almost 11 straight days into the show, because he was so dug in a hole that by the time I started ripping it back and pulling cardio down and bringing food back in, sleep improved, activity was way easier to hit, fatigue is dropping, performance in the gym's holding way easier, and it was just like he took off. And that is something that can happen, which can leave an athlete looking stringy and flat on stage as well. And I think a lot of that comes with the management of prep, but understanding that if you have to do it to get it done, managing that 14 days out or 10 days out rather than managing that 5 days out is so much easier to land on stage at the right place.
Yeah, at least you know where you're at. Because I've had that happen too, where someone drops to new lows every day. You're like, oh my gosh, like I'm up in food so much and I just can't keep up. And that's the rare situation where like there is some heavier meals that are going to have to go in, and fats are going to go pretty high to keep up.
Yeah.
I just made a reel on post-show hypermetabolic or hypothermic effect that occurs in like anorexia patients. Then they start like actually reintroducing food at levels that their thermic effect of food goes nearly double what normal is. So it actually is a true like metabolic response that occurs in some people once you start bringing food up. And think about someone with anorexia, like highly like adapted to like low energy amounts and just set up for that situation. But in a prep, like it's not anorexia, but you are in this type of like starved state and very adapted. That's part of what we see too. Is some people like extremely ramp up, get night sweats, and it's kind of a mess to really manage that in a peak week. But like you mentioned too, not to say that's that's it or that's only it, but it could be someone just starting to output a lot more too.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of a combination of all the variables. But the reason I stress getting to that point 2 weeks out is because I know after the first 2 to 3 days of pulling back which direction they're going to go, whether they're going to like speed up on me and I need to play catch up, or I have got someone who's responding well like Renee where they jump up and I can pull them back to baseline and then just go. And I think the communication between coach and athlete in that time frame is important, because you mentioned with Renee daily check-ins, right? I think at that 2 week out mark, once you start pulling back and testing these things, check-ins pretty much need to be daily.
Yeah, people jump quick. Like I had a bikini competitor last weekend that I added like not even much, like 30 grams of carbs in. This is a very low diet, but then she jumped like 2 pounds. I'm like, had to really assess like, was this GI related? Like what's going on? I'm like, let's leave it the same. Then weight came up a little bit more. I'm like, just someone that's not very, metabolically like unadaptive, just food just sticks.
Yeah.
So I don't want you to hear like Luke and I think like, man, I want that prep where I'm going to be eating like double the amount of food. It doesn't happen for everybody. Some people have to stay pretty low to hold it. And I think that's the person that, if they had a lot of fatigue and also new to this, could really struggle with being ready too far ahead.
Yeah,
so
I would agree. I would 100% agree.
You have to manage. And this same girl, like, I've worked with her for years, so she can very well handle what needs to be done. And that why and purpose there, like, far outweighs, like, any acute emotional drive for, food satisfaction. So we're in a good spot with her. But things to assess, it's a nice idea to be ready ahead, but you have to know for one, if it can even happen for the person you're working with, but also managing it for that exact particular situation.
Yeah, and realize we are talking about the ideal situation within a prep, and that there are preps where this does run into peak week, and you're playing that game of pulling back fatigue during peak week. But one of the things that I just want to kind of add as a note is, a lot of times, especially, I find this typically with like the smaller girls, and I had this with one of my wellness girls last year at the amateur level. The best look visually for an athlete is a reduced fatigue state, more so than a certain amount of food. So like I had an athlete who was similar to your bikini client that like if I added food, it just stuck. Like it was like duct tape fixing something that an engineer did wrong. It was unbelievable how fast she would jump up on me. And she had a really close time duration. So she had her regional qualifier on Saturday and her pro qualifier on Tuesday. So I pushed her pretty much into peak week because of the rate of loss that I had to do to get her there when I got her, because I didn't get her for the full prep. And I started loading her kind of in that time duration leading into the first show. And I was like, this is jumping way too high, way too fast. And she went protein veggie show day, the day after show day, the 2 days after show day, and on the pro qualifier. And she won the overall at a regional, and then she almost won a pro card at the pro qual. So it's like the best look is not always with more food, it's with a dropped fatigue state. And with that athlete, what I would have preferred to done is do that further out, where I could have kind of strung her into the lower days for the first show and just kind of held it, where the baseline diet was a bit higher, and we just kind of found that point where maintenance was easy to hold. I just find, even with experienced competitors, there's the expectation of more food, and that's not always the case, especially with like these smaller classes that don't carry quite as much tissue.
Yeah, I was going to say that's probably the specific division around it, because you just don't have a lot of muscle, so the glycogen load just doesn't really need to be there.
Yep.
Also, that's not really the requirement of the division to have like this exploding round muscle bellies and being like hard as nails. So it's an interesting shift that you don't really hear about, to be able to bring the cardio output much lower, but food goes lower too. You usually don't hear that one, but that's where nice. I mean, you keep a really open mind in your coaching because that could get cookie cutter.
Oh, it so could.
We could start increasing food, and you're only increasing food at different levels, but you never think to like lower food.
Yeah.
To be able to have like, we talk about high energy flux, right? Like a prep where you do a lot of cardio, but you eat a lot of food. But there's a balance within that. So for that athlete, like the low energy flux actually had her peak better.
Yeah, yeah. And so it's just a dynamic that I see that from being ready ahead type of a construct, the expectation sometimes hearing us talk about it, because you have people like Renee who are just career competitors and rip it off and get to eat all the food, is like the higher food is going to come for 2 weeks. And it's like, well, it's nice. And I'll probably give you food to pull the fatigue off, but at some point I might have to pull it back and coast you into the show, right?
Yeah, and it's you think more food's going to be less hunger, and it doesn't always mean that way. Like you have just some people are just big eaters and they're hungry no matter what. The food, focus is still there either way. So it just varies for the individual. So I know it could be a sexy idea, but the main sexy idea is getting on stage and being ready like you need to be.
Yeah.
And I would say most of the time being ready ahead will give you and your coach the best opportunities to help manage all these variables to where when you do get into peak week, it's not the gamble of rolling dice and trying to figure out like, why is my client holding water 3 days out? Like, put in the diuretic, let's cut water. When really, just like Luke said earlier, some of the best, peaking he's done, it's just dropping off fatigue. What is that fatigue? It causes water retention from higher cortisol levels and just, localized tissue inflammation. That stuff takes time to pull off. It's not pulled off with diuretics. So it's running a client through like a deload week, reducing that cardio output, managing training. And then you can really have a good gauge of fat versus water for a client, to where you would have less variables to have to manage during peak week and less of a gamble, which you should be doing less variable manipulation with running something like this and giving you and your athlete the best opportunity to not miss the mark. 100%. The other thing around this too, and I think it's even nicer for the larger enhanced athlete, is that you can figure out the PED protocol a bit more. Because the same thing happens as you're running, XYZ, ABCD drug. And, you wait till 5-7 days out, be like, all right, let me pull this growth hormone down and I'll pull out test here. And then you still don't see like the hard look come through. And you're like, well, that looks like it was still body fat. Shit. When it's like, could be body fat, but it very well could be in water.
Yeah.
That you don't need to address with a diuretic because that's a bigger gamble. You could have had this 3 week out ready mark where you're like, oh, you know what? There's water here. Pretty sure you can do some testing around PED changes to see if it is or not. And I did this on my past prep, like take an aromatase inhibitor for one night and see if you have a big weight drop the next day. And if that's water related, if you don't have a drop, you might have testosterone in a very good spot and estradiol isn't driving that process. And so that's an assessment tool. You could use that even way earlier, but now I have an idea of how I need to address my PEDs going into peak week. It's not just like, well, I don't know, I didn't even think about it yet. And I roll into peak week and how do I get this water off me? Like, oh, use a diuretic, then you're flat. So it's for the enhanced lifter, being ready ahead can have a lot of benefits for adjusting your stack.
Yeah.
And also with that, you're going to have far less risk of like losing tissue than one of the smaller class individuals because you have the PED cards to play.
100%. I agree wholeheartedly. One of the things that I do think is like a last little bit of like managing 2 weeks in or 3 weeks in is ready ahead is schedule and like trying to build it as much around how you're going to compete as you can. Like it's not feasible for a lot of people, but
Yeah.
most people at some point take off work to travel to the show, or they take off work so that the last like 5 days is a little bit more manageable. And so if you can plan like the scheduling around that a bit better, then it's going to allow for, again, one, a better drop in fatigue because you're just running the consistent day in, day out schedule. And as you kind of go, you're not introducing this new variable of like a wild schedule into the place. But you're also looking at, from like a coach's perspective, being able to manage the food amount that's going in, of what provides the best look around the time that show's going in. And I've even had testing done where if I do it well about the 2 weeks out mark on a Saturday when they don't work is when I prefer to do the testing, because I can make sure that I test food and visual change across the day, Saturday and Sunday, close to when they're going on the stage. And so I think that's something that's not brought up about being ready early, is you can already kind of get some ideas of how they change through the day as a part of that testing, and where that might land for show day.
Yeah, for a lot of shows, that's what I've done. It's because usually, like, say for 212, you could probably get like 2 meals in and then go on stage. So it would be 2 meals and go train. And you see how much food and water you have in, and post-training, how does that look?
Yeah.
Is it enough? Is it too much? And it just gives you at least an initial framework to work off of for when you do get to peak week. And I realize that's not realistic for a lot of divisions, because I have like female divisions, right, where all of a sudden the hair and makeup is like at 4 a.m. And it's like, and then they're traveling from, I don't know, like the West Coast to East Coast, and there's like a huge time change. It's like, okay, it just is what it is. Like, I can't have someone all of a sudden getting up at 4 a.m. Like,
Yeah, no.
But within reason, we at least have an idea of how much food and water and their body weight and the visuals of where we want to get them on stage if we had that time to be ready a bit early. I guess my advice around that is at least try to get to your show early enough to where you can get in some set routine, because if you do have that much variability in like time zones and also in your schedule, I have people that fly in like one day out or like the day of weigh-ins. I'm like, why did this get booked like this? It makes it so hard. So you need at least a couple days there at location to get routine, to lower stress, to not have travel being another variable that throws off the environment that you're trying to set and stabilize to manipulate the other variables you want to actually work on, like water and carbs.
Yeah.
Because if we have like sleep changes and meal times changing and stress is changing, and then now we're trying to also pull the levers of carbs and water, it's a lot to manage and creates much more variability to where we don't want to have to be guessing and rolling the dice on someone. So it with an athlete like that, it gives you less opportunity to make those changes because there's already too much change occurring around them. But
I agree.
I think that's a great consideration, is the routine and travel aspect around being ready early.
Yeah. Is there anything else within like that last 2 week time frame, like if you're ready early, you would bring up as something people need to watch for, or mistakes you've seen, or do you think we kind of covered most of it?
Man, I think that's pretty well covered. The only thing I wouldn't wait too last minute on would be like, and it's part of like the scheduling is, and some stuff doesn't matter, like booking like tanning and hair, makeup and stuff early enough so where you don't get, the shit end of the stick on something. But for a lot of times that's just way out of your control. Like we talked with Alyssa, like they just have the set times to go do it. Yeah. Posing, I just ran into a situation where like a client had scheduled posing one day out, and it was like 2 30-minute sessions of posing.
Oh no.
I'm like, what are they doing? Not my client, they're going to be guided by a coach, but what is the coach doing, right? Like,
so
there's no reason to do posing that long. Like, we've worked with Kenny Wallish for posing before, and he's come to the room like one day out, and it's like 5 minutes.
5 minutes
That's
post.
it. Like, let me see your poses, run through them, maybe a little tweak. That's it. Because one day out, you don't need to revamp someone's entire posing. Otherwise, what the hell have you been doing the whole time? It should be very low stress, like encouraging the athlete, little adjustment. All right, you're solid. Let's go. But that's it. So for like posing, consider that.
Yeah.
Like, don't let someone misguide you and have those last days like drive a bunch of more fatigue. So I would also just mention, like, really communicate with your coach around your schedule too, so they know what's going on. There's no surprises, because we do our best as we can as coaches, but man, there's a lot to think about. We're not following you around 24 hours out of the day. So if just ask if, and don't assume that something should be that way. Just ask your coaches if it sounds right or not, to help give you the best opportunity to get out there. But man, overall, I think that covers a lot of ground.
Yeah.
If you have any questions on being ready early or anything, like, leave them down below. And Luke and I have also covered this pretty heavy in J3U about guiding that process of what do you do when someone's ready early, how do you set up nutrition, PDs, training. The whole thing all the way leading to the show. So that's all in our coursework. So if you want to learn more, check it out. But until next time, we will talk to you then.